Okay, so our first talk today, we have Chris Anderson talking about pitfalls of low-code approaches, low-code dragons. And I believe, Chris, you're giving this talk at Denver Startup Week also. Is that right?
I am not. I applied and did not get in this year. So
Okay,
try again next
their
year.
loss. Well,
Yeah.
next year when you apply, we can all vote to
Okay.
make sure it gets in. So.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah. Thanks for having me too. Definitely appreciate this chance to talk to you guys. So today I wanted to kind of share my company's experience with a low-code development platform. The talk will be pretty high level, no technical knowledge needed, and it's really geared towards anyone interested in kind of when to consider low code, and honestly when to run from it, especially leaders of a business weighing that build versus buy decision, and if you're going to decide to build it, what you want to build it in. And this is a fairly new industry. I think people are still kind of getting their hands around it, and it's changing pretty rapidly too. So there's a lot to. I think a lot of companies are starting to explore this, and it's still a bit on the fringes of of mainstream development. A little bit of introduction to myself. I would put a headshot in there if I liked pictures of myself, but I don't. So there's a silhouette. Myself, I've been in IT for about 16 years. I come more from the systems and network admin background, professional services, and IT operations. One of the key things to know, and kind of as I'm going through the story, a good thing to know about me is I don't have a development experience. So that is not the background I come from. And then, but by the end of this, turns out, we were getting into that development world. And about my company, Velocity Global, in no way is it sponsoring this, but again, it kind of helps to understand the business a little bit, to talk about how we got to where we are. And we're about 6 years old, been growing pretty rapidly, roughly doubling every year. So the scale is going up quite a bit. And we do international PEO services. If you're not familiar with that, it's we hire employees on behalf of the companies and handle all of their HR, payroll, and benefits when companies are moving into new countries. So a couple of other things to know are that we've been profitable since near the beginning, but no funding. So budgets have always been constrained, and we're also in a unique space where there is no software out there that we could go purchase off the shelf and to meet our needs. And so as we were growing and we were starting looking at software that we needed to scale our operations, the company was adamant about no development, right? And myself, not coming from that background, I wasn't able to realize whether or not we truly needed it. But as we were looking at that build versus buy question, and looking for a new solution, we were really focused on SaaS, really focused on trying to find a piece of software that could do what we needed it to do, and it just didn't exist. And so what we ended up doing was finding a lot of promise in low-code development platforms. And so quick check-in on kind of what that is if you're not familiar. They're platforms that focus on visual app building with minimal or no hand coding. And that's really key because what they're trying to do is allow people to take kind of these WYSIWYG editors to be able to drag and drop different elements of applications, put them together into a page, and build both native web and mobile applications at the same time. The promises are pretty high at this point, and that's most companies definitely tend to oversell their capabilities, but given the newness of this industry, like I said, they promise a lot. They try to promise things like continuous improvement, higher productivity for your teams, increased agility. And one of the biggest things that they try to promise is, or help with, is citizen development, right? Right now, or for a long time, it's been hard to find developers, and it's even harder to find good developers. So the chance for average business people to come in and develop their own application is very promising, and can ideally help lower those costs. And over the last three plus years, there's been a lot of change in this industry. A couple of research firms have say that 2019 it was about a $10 billion industry. This year, they're estimating it to be about 13 billion, and they're estimating that 30% growth rate will continue year over year for the next decade. So a couple of different firms are estimating it'll be $140 to $150 billion industry by 2030. So there's a lot of growth there. And also just a lot of change. At the bottom there's just in the last 3 years, there have been a lot of growth here. With Amazon is in the middle of beta test of Honeycode, their low and no code development platform. Microsoft has the Power Platform and Power Apps. Salesforce 2 years ago put out their visual lightning tools. And then just a lot of movement as well. So Appian had a $75 million IPO about 3 years ago. Google bought AppSheet, ServiceNow bought SkyGiraffe, and it's a lot of acquisitions, a lot of consolidation going on in this space. And for us, a young company, with no development team and a goal of not becoming a development company because we were and are a services company. There's a lot of interest in this, right? They try to promise this, this small utopia of like rapid development by anyone. And their goal is that everyone can jump into this with a much lower learning curve, develop their own solutions, and businesses don't need to depend on and wait for their development teams. That's one of the bigger things that they're trying to promise. And then they also aim for shorter release cycles and development cycles, lowering costs, and then releasing modular pieces where they help provide you with things like login and authentication, search functionality, and different things like that, and allow you to kind of build the pieces that are unique to your application. And so we went this route. We started building a custom HRIS that was it's some HRIS functionality, some CRM, but in a way that that most CRM and HRS applications just couldn't do. And for us, it did work at first. We launched our first version of the application after about 4 months, and it was a pretty good amount of code, a pretty good amount of functionality for 4 months, and super proud of it at the start. We thought we were on a pretty good road to balancing out this focus on customization as opposed to truly building an application. But what we found is as we were starting to build these different pieces, they didn't always fit. Version 1, like I said, looked pretty smooth, but as we got to a version 2, we started seeing some new challenges. For us, one of those challenges was, like I mentioned, like search functionality, where they have these built-in pieces that are supposed to work. But what we found is like their built-in search functionality didn't quite work with our permissions model. And so we ended up having to scrap their built-in search, which was supposed to be a big time saver, and building our own. Version 2.5, we started to see some more cracks in this model, and we were actually starting to wrestle with the platform itself. So a couple were pretty serious too. Like again, I mentioned that they have their own, most of these have their own login and authentication processes, and for us, we just needed to tweak it a little bit, right? Because it's a puzzle piece, and to them, usually these turn out to be little black boxes of functionality where they say, here's our login process, and you can use it, but if you can't change it, right? And so for us, we got to a point where we had to tweak that. And so we ended up having to build our own anyway. And so then we hit about 15 months in, and we had a pretty major release that just kind of broke things outright, largely due to all these different pieces not quite fitting together right. And as we added more complexity, more of these pieces, things just got tougher and tougher to manage. And what we ended up with was this kind of new shiny road that we were on that maybe the base platform was pretty smooth. We had all these roadblocks on top of it. For a variety of reasons, right? As most of these things are, it's not just for one, but like I said, one of those ones is that those pieces that they promise to give you and to be able to use and reuse don't always fit together, right? But for us, another one was that the we weren't accepting the full software development lifecycle, and I think this is one of the biggest pitfalls that you can step into with low code is if you don't recognize that you're building an application, right? You start shortcutting the process. And I think most people here are in the development world, the product development world. For us, we were not at the start. And so we were taking shortcuts to the software development lifecycle, right? We weren't doing proper planning, analysis, design. We were rolling out code, we were maintaining it, but our testing processes were weak as well. And I think any company who builds anything that doesn't follow the right processes is going to run into problems. But when you don't think that you're building software, it's really easy to skip stuff, right? And you don't recognize the importance of following this, and you don't build the rigor into your processes to do things correctly. And it's a really easy pitfall to step into. And again, anyone not doing these things will run into problems. But for us over time, we really had to step this stuff up and start following the full software development lifecycle. We had to do the proper planning. We had to actually meet with our teams ahead of time and do proper development before we even started putting keys or hands to the keyboard. And testing again was a big one that we were shortcutting. And eventually what it came down to is we just had to recognize that even though we had originally intended on doing more of the configuration route, we just had to admit that we were developing software, right? And we were suddenly developing our own applications, and we just had to come to terms with that. And whether it's JavaScript or low code, you're developing an application. And at the end of the day, you still have to follow the rigor that goes into full software development, or else you can really run into a lot of problems. So there's definitely a variety of issues going on, but after we went through the process of fixing our processes, right, and our people problems, we were still left with a lot of problems we couldn't reconcile. And where we ended up after about 18 months is deciding that we needed to leave that. And actually, again, we'd already embraced that we were developing software. We just needed to actually move into best practices and move into true software development. And so we ended up in that situation of, building that airplane after we jumped off the cliff, 18 months later. And while those are some of the big ones, I think there's a lot of other things that don't always work with low code, and you can kind of easily run into this danger zone of different things that get combined and then lead to the systems breaking down. Where we were trying to build an application that the majority of our teams would be using and was truly business critical. And once we got everyone into it and started using it and got people depending on it, the stakes were raised significantly, right? And so a couple of things that would stand out to me as reasons to avoid these low-code platforms would be if your applications need to span multiple teams. Ownership of the applications, requirements gathering, all those things are magnified when you've got more than one team or one person who's involved. And I think that it's a really good reason to avoid these platforms. Another one would be if it's customer facing. Once you expose your application to your customers, the stakes get raised significantly, right? And people have a much higher expectation if they're paying for your services, and part of that is an application. And as soon as you do that, you need to be ready to have much higher quality and be able to have that rigor involved in the process from start to finish. Another one would be scale. If your company is expecting to grow significantly, for us, like I said, we were doubling every year. And so the challenges that we faced 12 months ago are different than the challenges we're facing now. And the challenges we're facing now are significantly different than the ones we were facing 2 years ago when we were a quarter the size. And what we were finding is these platforms can have a tough time keeping up with the rate of change. And it's in requirements especially, and not so much like performance scaling, because a lot of them do have that built in, but more about like for us, that the rapid change in requirements around like authentication and search functionality were really good examples of something that we thought would meet our needs for a long time, and within 12 months we found that we were changing faster than the platform could account for, and had to go out and build these things on our own anyway. In addition to that, just complexity. The more modules you add in, the more functionality, the more complex your application gets, the harder these things can be to hold them together. And when your pieces don't fit well together, again, this goes for any application, right? Things start to break down pretty quickly. But in these platforms, it can be harder to keep them fitting as smoothly as they need to. And then the last one is if it is truly business critical, especially if it's any kind of intellectual property. I would 100% not recommend putting it in there, because you are tying your critical business applications and you're tying your intellectual property to a platform that you cannot get out of, right? If you build your own application, you can mix and match pieces, you can move code, you can move to different platform providers. But when you're tied to a low-code platform, you cannot move. There's no way of migrating unless you go rebuild it 100%. And losing that ability is huge as your company grows. And that's one we learned the hard way. And so what I've kind of ended up thinking here is that for me, these low-code platforms are the Excel macro of 2020. And that could be good or bad depending on your history with macros, but they're really powerful because they can allow people to do some pretty cool things for themselves and allow people to automate some of their processes. But I would never run my business on an Excel macro, right? Now, a couple of areas where it fit really well is like I said, in enabling people to solve their own problems. I think that this is a really cool use case for a lot of these platforms if you're able to maintain scope, right? And if you can maintain that scope around a single use application, maybe even a departmental application that a smaller group of people uses, it can fit really well because it does allow people who are really close to the problems to be able to solve it themselves. And a lot of those questions around scale and allowing multiple teams or having multiple teams in there get alleviated as long as you can maintain that scope. But again, the hard part can really be if one department develops an application and another team wants to start using that. You could have some people in accounting controlling some people in your treasury teams applications, and they may not always get along that well. There can be a lot of communication problems in maintaining those over time. And so if you can maintain that scope, these can be really good uses for these platforms. Another one is if you're in a larger enterprise and you've got a lot of baggage, right? If you've got legacy systems to connect, sometimes these platforms have specialized in helping to integrate different systems, right? Where maybe the majority of your business is done in these old applications that either, it may feel like are never going to get removed or replaced because they've been there forever and so much of the business relies on them, but they want to connect it to maybe a newer application or a newer front end, things like that. Sometimes these platforms have done a really good job of allowing you to connect these legacy apps with the newer apps. And then they've also done, there's also a lot of functionality in there around robotics, desktop robotics, automating these manual processes, again, centered around legacy systems that have been around for a long time and that can help reduce a lot of people's clicks. There's some pretty cool functionality there. And kind of the third one for me that I see as like really potentially good points is rapid prototyping for proof of concepts for non-developers. I would guess a extra developer would never want to step into one of these and start working out of one. But if you're a business user and you've got some ideas and you want to put something together as a starting point, this could be some of these easier platforms like a Bubble or an Appian could be really good places to go to put together a prototype, put together your idea and help start demonstrating it. But absolutely, if this is your core product, core IP, you want to be moving out of that as soon as possible. And so at the end of the day, like, is it a good thing or a bad thing? I think it's kind of it's up to you and your use case, right? There are a couple of use cases that I think do fit pretty well, but it really depends on keeping those use cases small, keeping them within scope, and then and not running your business off of them. And that's one of the biggest lessons we learned is that we needed to be the driving our own ship, right, and be in control of it from start to finish. And not having that control was leading to a lot more problems than we could stomach. And so now, like I mentioned, 18 months later, we're kind of processing out a lot of this and actually recreating from scratch things that we in retrospect should have just started with 18 months ago. So that's the end of it today. Thank you for your time. Appreciate it. And if we opened any questions about our journey or any other experiences we had inside of here.
Did you experiment with different low-code platforms?
We evaluated several, and then we ended up picking one. And since then, I've looked at a couple others. Like I've put together a couple of proof of concepts inside of 2 others. So I've got direct experience with about 3.
Do you have any opinions about what's a good one to run experiments on, or are there any different factors?
Definitely, yeah. Like when I talk about those 3 use cases around like the enterprise baggage, the proof of concepts, or like the business ones, the small departmental use cases, I think that they excel at different things. Like if you're already in Salesforce, the Salesforce Lightning, their visual connectors can be a pretty good tool there when your data is already inside the platform. So that'd be a good use case to go for that. I would never implement Salesforce for something like this, though, right? Mm-hmm. Unless you're already in it, right? But it's a pretty good way of doing it on top of that. If you're like looking at like a smaller departmental thing, like a Bubble or an Appian, I think are pretty good ones to start with because they're pretty easy to pick up, and they're pretty there's a lot of training and tutorials around them, and they're very visually focused. One of the things that I can't remember where I heard somebody mention this a little while ago. It's like, but that one of the things to watch out for is if you're going to learn, you've got to learn something because they all have a learning curve, right? Like dragging and dropping elements onto a page is easy enough, but then once you want to do real work, you got to figure out how the platform works, and you're going to spend a good amount of time learning it. And at some point, you got to ask yourself, like, is it worth putting 50 hours into learning something like a low-code platform, or would you be better off just spending 50 hours learning JavaScript, right? And that there might be, you're not going to become a master in 50 hours, but maybe you're better off learning something that can take you anywhere, or almost anywhere. And then there's also the ones that geared towards enterprise.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so there's a couple of them out there that are geared towards enterprise and like those different connectors and things like that. Yeah. Sorry, did I answer your question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay, cool.
I think Greg was about to ask a question, and then we've got one from Byron after that.
Okay.
Yeah, first of all, just on the sort of the governance nightmare, you talked about the Excel macro example.
Yeah.
I don't know if anybody realizes, but enterprise service buses were created out of that itch that needed to be scratched, because an energy utility had spreadsheets all over the damn place with Excel macros to run the entire business. And that was, ESBs came out of that as a way to connect all of the data without, sort of this individual governance that was just crazy and nuts. My question was, how did you vet the software to find what would work? And did you said you weren't a developer, but did you have developers that could kind of look for things to say, this might not meet our needs, or, to take you in the right direction as you were using non-code based stuff to implement and deploy stuff? Does that make sense?
Yep. Yeah, and we've picked a partner to help us with that. So we got a consulting firm, and this is definitely one of our short-sightedness, is that it was one of those things we thought that because we were more focused on the configuration, we thought that we could get a product implemented in a certain time frame and be done, and not recognizing the continual nature of this. And so we used a partner to help us out with that, and then they were the experts in that particular product. Yeah.